Ray Thistlethwayte, welcome to Australian Musician.
How's it going?
Good. We're having a chat today because you're playing a show for the Melbourne International Jazz Festival on October 21 at the Jazzlab. It's called Take Two,
Yep.
and you're reimagining Stevie Wonder's Innervisions album. Apparently, they played the album first. That's the concept, and then you do your reinterpretation. Have you done this type of show before?
I haven't actually. No, it's a very interesting format. I think it's it gets the sort of wheels turning in your brain as to how you'd interpret it and what you do with the concept. But I think it is a cool concept because I guess it in a way it's sort of a kind of a way to reinvigorate maybe an album that people have either not heard for a long time or maybe even never heard that might be quite an old release, and then sort of bring it into maybe a contemporary uh, timing or setting, or and just the fact that there's something that's of a recorded format and a live format on the same night, sort of one after another, is I think that's kind of there's a certain travel that happens between that format and the other. So you know, it's an interesting, I guess, almost like a musical challenge in a way of how you might do that. And there's so many different ways that you might want to interpret certain songs. Um, but that's probably why I chose this album because I thought, it's got to be something that I have already immersed myself in at a younger, age. And but I still haven't really worked out exactly what we might do. But I think being in the jazz idiom, it's going to be, heavily reliant on some sort of level of spontaneity. But I think we want to have some sort of roadmap, which we'll put together in some rehearsals.
Yeah. As a musician, when you learn these songs and you pick them apart, what's one thing you notice about the songwriting of Stevie Wonder?
Um, well, he was a master of, you know, being able to make melodies which were incredibly singable and accessible, but then have also almost a deceptive level of uh, musicianship just sort of woven through everything, from the melody writing, which is literally up there, if not better than anything the Beatles might have done, or Brian Wilson. It's that sort of, or, classical musicians, from hundreds of years before. The stuff has that level of strength to it, and sometimes it's got that level of simplicity to it. But if you actually look at what melodies, relate to certain harmonic things that are going on in chords and some of the rhythmic things that are going on, um, it goes a lot deeper than just being a simple, accessible, melody written uh, songwriting catalog. It's, that's what Stevie Wonder was able to do, I think, better than most other Motown or jazz or pop artists, really. And the other thing that you realize is that he really was, or is, uh, one of the world's most talented multi-instrumentalists. He played drums on a lot of his own stuff. Obviously, an incredible keyboard player, but you've got things like, chromatic harmonica. You've got incredible soundscapes with doing, a lot of the synthesizers he was using were only able to produce one tone at a time, and he's multi-tracked a lot of that sort of stuff. So it's sort of also got a type of recording, uh, a trail blazing recording sort of thing going on that, you hear about with bands like the Beatles, I guess. I sort of, in a way, I think he's a very different genre to artists like the Beatles, but he's definitely in my head been as influence, as much of an influence on modern neo soul and, things like acid jazz and other electronica, that kind of stuff, as the Beatles have been.
Yeah. So for this performance, will you bring along much gear? Will you use a digital keyboard or just acoustic piano?
Well, the venue, I believe the venue's Jazzlab in Brunswick, so
Yeah.
they've got a really good acoustic piano there. I think it'd be, something that I'd want to at least have as a bit of a core part of the live performance there. Just because it's such a brilliant sounding room, and I've sat in the very back row of a lot of gigs at Jazzlab, whether it's watching Barney McCall or other horn players on stage, and you can hear everything, all the way through the room. So I think it's a good acoustic space to employ the sort of acoustic stuff. But it has, yeah, I mean, what I like about this type of album is obviously you've got a lot of vocal melodies there. So maybe some of those can become instrumental melodies, and maybe some of the things that might have been in terms of a genre, rooted in more, I guess, electronic meets soul meets rhythm and blues meets sort of like a Motown sort of style. Maybe there's a way to bring that into more even Ornette Coleman style free jazz. I'm not sure. Maybe there's a way to do that. I don't know if we're going to be specifically playing swinging versions of the melodies but there might be a section where that can happen. But certainly, for instance, I thought originally of also doing an instrumental album and using that as the album of choice for take two. But I thought if you're going from an instrumental album that might have, let's say, guitar, bass, drums, and then you might have a similar instrumentation for the live reimagining, it's not really going to have as much scope to sort of really break it out into a different thing. So I think there's a lot of depth actually in doing an album which has a lot of vocal on it, and then thinking about more instrumental versions of maybe some stuff. And then maybe, there's also things you can do with reharmonizing and, changing feels and those kind of stuff. But I'll just try and put the musical, elements and principles of the musical design hat on and try and see what we all might want to do. And it's all going to be about how we all work as a collective, in terms of the other musicians.
So how many musicians will you have on the night?
Well, it'll be at least three. It's going to be myself and Felix Bloxham and a musician I've actually never worked with before by the name of Brett Williams. But Felix is a good friend of his, and he's come on very high recommendations. So I think that three of us will be able to make quite a lot of layered sound. But I might be augmenting this with, I think, maybe one sort of frontline horn player. So I've got a few guys in mind, or I'm not sure yet on that last musical chair, but it'll be at least a trio. So I think it'll be an interesting discovery, musically, to sort of work with someone I've never worked with as well.
Yeah. Um, Stevie Wonder's not necessarily jazz, although there's probably some jazz concepts in the way he plays. Who have been some jazz influences in your musical journey?
I would say definitely Keith Jarrett to a large extent. Um, yeah, in my teens, I listened to a lot of Keith Jarrett. When I first heard Keith, I was a little bit sort of, I was so in awe of his incredible rubato approach to certain uh, melodies, and then, being able to kind of use almost like a classical apex to his dynamics of certain lines and how he was putting those together. I was a bit sort of freaked out by it because it was so deep and so open. But then sooner or later, I came around to it because I didn't hear anyone who was really as it seemed so just sheer inspiration and creativity and sort of unbridled improvising on his music than a lot of other artists I'd listened to. Previous to that, I was probably into more sort of people with more of a rhythmic structured approach, like Chick Corea as a keyboard player, who also is harmonically very amazing. And I listened to quite a bit of maybe Pat Metheny, And then I was into a lot of jazz fusion guys like John McLaughlin and Alan Holdsworth. And in terms of maybe trumpet players and sax players and other sort of brass and woodwind sort of side of things, I'd probably be more into, I mean, I like Steve Coleman. I like Freddie Hubbard, of course. And I've done a bit of a going back into, I guess, more. I mean, look, Oscar Peterson, of course, I think he's an amazing technician and great sort of blues player and just got an amazing feel. And of course, Wynton Kelly's sort of out of that same sort of thing. So I think those two guys have sort of been a bit of a piano feel sort of touchstone for what I do. But I think also just vocal artists, people like Ella Fitzgerald and Joni Mitchell and um, yeah, I think John Hendricks and Lambert Hendricks and Ross, lots of different sort of artists have been part of what have brought me into listening to a lot of jazz. And I don't know, I'm kind of influenced just as much by, I think, rock music and classical music and soul music and any other real genre. I think just through my parents listening, my mum used to teach a lot of classical piano and my dad was into a lot of 60s songwriting, more, popular bands and also like a lot of blues based English riff bands like Deep Purple and Cream. So I don't really see it as one specific style. I just hear various chords and melodies and various things going on, and they all have their own sort of, I guess, accent or language or dialect or however you want to look at it. But
Yeah.
it all informs something, if you listen to everything and just have an open mind, I think.
Yeah. You've just come off this huge Best of All Worlds tour with Sammy Hagar and Joe Satriani and Jason Bonham. Does it do you need a bit of distance from that to get into a headspace to play this other stuff, acoustic piano and smaller gigs?
Well, we had a break between the American tour, which was 28 shows around the States over a course of about 7.5 weeks. And then there was about 10 days off. I came back to Melbourne for a day and then flew to South Australia where I did 3 nights with James Morrison, and it was his trio. So it was sort of James on, trumpet and flugelhorn and piccolo, bass trumpet, and of course, a lot of trombone and piano. And then there was a chamber section there. It was, a string quartet essentially, and then clarinet and oboe and trying to think of who else was on it. Oh, flute, of course. And then there was James's son on bass and James's other son, Will, on guitar. So it was kind of a baptism by fire getting back into that and having to rehearse into that kind of thing. But it was a really refreshing reset back into Australia. Like I had a great time going from playing essentially a Van Halen driven tour catalog, to draw from. And just straight into playing. Also, Marian Petrescu, who's an incredible Romanian. I think he's based in Finland these days, but he's an incredible jazz and classical piano player. So it was all of us on stage at various points, and I had a featured night on the second of the 3 nights. But they were all incredible and great improvisers, and even the string quartet was playing stuff that I hadn't, been on stage playing for months, and it was definitely a different thing, but it was a really positive thing. I had a great time because it just was like, oh, look, if you're going to get back into something that's different, you may as well go the whole way and just be thrown right into it. And it had a sort of freshness to it again because, there's nothing like being on a new stage with a new acoustic setup and a new vibe and new instruments, and it sort of allows you to almost like collaborate with the audience being there, and they can see everything unfolding. So that was I really had a great experience. Then we went to Japan for a week. Just literally got back a couple of days ago, and then I'm going to be into other things. I'm writing some music it's sort of a crossover steampunk children's Christmas thing at the moment. I'm doing that for a couple of days with my old music producer friend. And then I'll be doing a bit of Thirsty Merc stuff, going on the road with the Fabulous Caprettos. Of course, I've got a gig this Friday night at Jazzlab as well, which is my own show. So I'm doing, I'm just jumping around from various things, and it is a bit of a juggling act, but I guess it's a little bit like speaking different languages and going to different places. I guess once you're there in the local thing, if you want to order food or a coffee or a beer or whatever, you got to speak the local language. So you just got to do your best. See if people understand what you're trying to say.
Were you surprised when you got the Sammy call? I know you've been playing with Joe beforehand, but did that surprise you?
Uh, well, it was a nice surprise. It's always nice to be asked to do any show, and I think at that stage I'd played about 150 gigs with Joe. Well, maybe I'd played 120 gigs with Joe because we had an upcoming. I already knew that I was going to do the Sammy thing before I played the previous Joe, which was actually Joe and Steve Vai and two different bands and a bit of collaboration at the end of that show. So, but I played over 100 shows with Joe at that point, and I think that really what it came down to was that they needed someone to be on backing vocals because without Eddie Van Halen there, he passed away sadly in 2020. So, and actually Joe Satriani, a little known fact about him is he actually sang on 7 of Crowded House's album, the one that had, I'm not sure the name of the album, but the one that had Don't Dream It's Over and some of the big hits. Right. He actually sang on 7 songs backing vocals on that very album. So he's actually a great singer. But I think the fact that he was given the task to be sort of almost like the Eddie Van Halen role, he said, look, I don't want to be doing all the Eddie stuff and having to do vocals. I know a guy who can do keyboards. Obviously, Eddie Van Halen was a great keyboard player as well. So he said, I think it came out of that need to have someone who was strong on vocal, strong on keyboards, but also could play some guitar and, shake a tambourine here and there and be the right look and feel. But they also knew what I'm like to travel with already. So in that way, I'm not surprised that I got the call because I know these guys often have a stable of friends and musical people that they sort of know. And as you know, if you're going to be sort of living together on the road, they've got to know whether you're a good fit in terms of that. But what was, nice about it is when I got into the rehearsals, Mike Anthony, who's the bass player and the original Van Halen bass player, he's got a very high tenor voice. And Sammy was often, as he always was in the old recordings and live shows, you'd have Eddie Van Halen going lower under where Sammy was. And then I sort of took that role really in terms of where the singing was. And then you had Michael Anthony up the top because he's always had that absolutely high. He's almost like the Roger Taylor, Roger Taylor in Queen used to sing the absolutely high stuff. So they sort of already had their kind of vocal registers in a way worked out. And so it just was one of those things. I was very happy to get the call and it sort of broke me, into this different type of show as well. It was very much about a visual interpretation of Sammy's career. And, I knew songs that were synth driven, like Jump, of course. And I thought, well, that's just going to be absolutely hilariously fun to play, because I've always been a fan of that song. And I thought I get to play it with some of the members of the original thing. And of course, Jason Bonham is tremendous. So I knew I was going to hear a lot of stories from the old rock and roll world, and it was great fun. It was really, really cool run actually, and everybody was really generous and really nice, and I learned a lot about a larger scale production, which was cool, and yeah, still tired from the travel just from Japan, but I'm no rest of the wicked. I just got to get back in and start more stuff. So. Yeah. Let's see where that goes.
With that tour and your gear, did it take a while to decide what you needed to use?
Gear-wise, I have been taking my own personal Nord keyboard, which is an 88 note weighted Nord, but it's a slightly older model than that they've got a Nord Stage 4 now, but I'm using the Nord Stage 2 iteration, so it's 2 generations back. But because I own my own one of those, I knew that I could do a bit of programming and programming of the sounds in advance. So what they ended up doing is getting a second one of those as a sort of a backup keyboard, or have a second keyboard, and they also liked the visual of it because they could get a sort of V-shaped 2 keyboard array on a bunch of drum hardware, and that sort of became the staple of my sort of station, I guess, where I was. And then guitar-wise, I just use emulations of amplifiers, and I'm just using direct sort of emulations of things that are sort of software-driven amps really these days. And Joe Satriani doesn't do that, and I totally understand, because he's using feedback and using other sort of things where the vibration of the guitar body and the sort of amps need to sort of speak to each other a lot. But, you know, there's enough volume and notes and amazing articulation coming out of Joe's guitar. I don't need to step on his toes and try and be that guy. I was happy to be the sort of main keyboard guy and let him fill that with that sort of tall, wide sound. And it's a great sound. I mean, he's got an incredible guitar sound, which I've always been a fan of. So, yeah, the gear came together very practically. I was like, well, I need a way to, you know, I'm only going to be in town a couple of days before we start the rehearsal, so I need a way to basically build sounds even in a 24-hour period before I get on to the rehearsals. It's all pretty sort of rip and run. You know, you get in, you just landed in a new place. You got 24 hours before the rehearsals start. You got to get your sounds together, and you've obviously learned the music and checked out the material, but there's always a lot of technical stuff that you have to figure out and get your in-ear mixes and stuff going on, so you can hear what you want to hear on stage. And you don't have as much time to do all this stuff as you think you do, as you think you will. It's always like gets eaten into at the last minute.
So what do you reckon the chances of that tour getting to Australia?
Well, I think it's up to how much Sammy wants to work. You know, Sammy's 76. He's been around a long time, playing lots of shows over his whole career. And I think he's been very successful in his career. And I think in not just music, in other sort of ventures. And I think if he wants to make the trip, he will. There's been no 100% announcement of anything except a run that seems to be happening in the US for about 3.5 weeks next year. Aside from that, I do know that he's got some desire to hit a few other sort of territories, and I think one of those is South America, but I don't know exactly what dates he might be thinking of that. And I think he might like to do a European run. Sadly, the time to do the Aussie stuff would have been after Japan. He just went that far. Australia doesn't seem like too far to go after you go to Japan, but us Aussies know it's about 10-hour flight if you're going from Sydney to Tokyo, so it isn't that close. But most of the US-based artists will often do a run through Asia and then sort of continue on. But that said, you know, it's not out of the question. I think he had a really good time on this run, and I think that he's definitely thinking, you know, he definitely said vocally a few times at, you know, some dinner hangs afterwards or whatever. He said, look, I proved to myself that I can do this, you know, as long as I get not too many shows in a row, because it's a 2-hour 15 gig, you know, he's singing a lot. So as long as he can have that recovery time in between shows, I know he can nail it.
Yeah. All right. Well, in the meantime, excuse me, we look forward to the Take Two show as part of the Melbourne International Jazz Festival on October 21 at the Jazzlab. And it's been great to catch up.
You too, Greg. Yeah, thanks for the chat. I've always been a huge fan of Jazzlab, been a huge fan of the Melbourne International Jazz Festival. It's a really, really amazing event. It's a world-class jazz festival. I played with some of the biggest jazz festivals, like the North Sea Jazz Festival in Rotterdam, and I've played with people like Lewis Cole at the Fuji Rock Festival and a whole bunch of other sort of jazz-based things around Australia. And it really is one of the best festivals you can attend. So I hope people come along to, of course, my gig with Felix and Brett, and maybe another unannounced at this point guest artist. But I hope they get along to multiple shows. I'll definitely be trying to attend as many as I can.